Hadith 265. From Abu Darda, he says the Prophet was leading us in prayer and we heard him say, A'udhu billahi mink, I seek refuge in Allah from you. And then he said in the Salaah, Al'anuka bila'natillah, I curse you with the curse of Allah. He said this 3 times. And he stretched out his hands as if he was trying to reach out for something. Then when the prayer was over, we asked him, O Messenger of Allah, we heard you say in the Salaah something we've never heard before from you. And we saw you stretch out your hand. And so the Prophet replied, Inna aduwallahi iblisa ja'a bishihabin min nar liyaj'alahu fi wajhi. He says, verily the enemy of Allah, Iblis, came with a firebrand of Jahannam and he tried to put it on my face. And so I said, A'udhu billahi mink, I seek refuge in Allah from you. And this was said 3 times. Then I said, Al'anuka bila'natillahi tamma, I curse you with the complete curse of Allah. But still Iblis did not desist. And this happened 3 times. Then I wanted to stretch out and seize him physically. He said, ثُمَّ أَرَدْتُ أَخْذَهُ وَاللَّهِ لَوْلَا دَعْوَةُ أَخِينَا سُلَيْمَانَ لَأَصْبَحَ مُوَثَّقًا يَلْعَبُ بِهِ وِلْدَانُ أَهْلِ الْمَدِينَةِ. And Wallahi, if it was not for the dua of our brother Sulaiman, then Iblis would have been tied up and the children of Al-Madinah would be playing with him. So what's happening here is that we find Iblis has come to distract the Prophet and to try to harm the Prophet as he is praying. Generally speaking, the shayateen would come to you in your prayer and whisper into you different thoughts, trying to distract you from your prayer. Or perhaps they might incite and encourage somebody else to pass by in front of you in your prayer. Remember what the Prophet ﷺ said. He said to ward off anyone trying to pass by in front of you, and you're even allowed to fight him, because if he does not desist, it means that he is the shaitan. And another version, that he has a shaitan with him, because it is only the shaitan who would want to distract you in your prayer by either whispering into you or making or inciting somebody to pass by in front of you. Here we find the Prophet ﷺ saying, I seek refuge in Allah from you. He is clearly addressing someone else besides Allah. However, is it not true that if you address someone in your salah besides Allah, then this breaks your prayer? Now, of course, that's different to making a dhikr. So, for example, if you sneeze and you say, Alhamdulillah, this is not addressing anyone. This is a dhikr of Allah Jalla wa Ala. And if anything, you're addressing Allah. So this does not break the prayer. But addressing someone else would break the prayer if you did it intentionally. So, for example, saying, Ya Rahamakallah to the one who sneezes and says, Alhamdulillah. But here we can say that the Prophet was not addressing another human, rather he was addressing a jinni. And so that would not break the prayer. So addressing another human would break the prayer. The second issue here is that the Prophet says, I curse you with the complete curse of Allah. And he said this 3 times. However, we do have another narration in which the Prophet forbade one of his companions from cursing the shaitan or making dua against the shaitan. So as we find in an authentic narration, a Sahabi is riding his donkey and his donkey tripped up, and so in response to this the companion said, Da'isa shaitan, may shaitan be destroyed. And the Prophet said to him, La taqul da'isa shaitan, do not say may the shaitan be destroyed. فَإِنَّكَ إِذَا قُلْتَ هَذَا تَعَظَمَ حَتَّى يَكُونَ مِثْلَ الْبَيْتِ. Because if you said something like this, the shaitan will feel very prideful and he will feel great in himself until he will become as big as a house. And the shaitan will boast, بِقُوَّتِي, by my power. وَلَكِنْ قُلْ بِسْمِ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّكَ إِذَا قُلْتَ ذَلِكَ تَصَاغَرَ حَتَّى يَكُونَ مِثْلَ الذُّبَابِ. But rather you should say Bismillah, because if you say that, the shaitan will become small until he is like a fly. So what we learn here is if you stumble or your animal stumbles, then you should not curse the shaitan or make dua against the shaitan. Rather you should say Bismillah, because this will be a humiliation for shaitan, whereas cursing the shaitan will be a means for him to boast and become prideful. And also from that narration, which we have just mentioned now, we learn that if you're going to make something haram or forbid something, then give people an alternative. So here the Prophet has said, do not say Ta'isa shaitan, but rather you say Bismillah. So always give people an alternative. However, in the narration in the Sahih here, we find the Prophet is making a la'an on the shaitan. So how do we reconcile between the two narrations? We reconcile by saying that in this particular narration, the shaitan was trying to overcome the Prophet. Whereas in the other narration, in Sunan Abi Dawud, about the donkey tripping over, the shaitan was not trying to overcome that particular Sahabi, or try to overpower him. So because of this difference, we have a difference in the ruling, and so it is permissible for the Prophet then to make the curse against the shaitan because the shaitan was trying to overpower him. But if you happen to be met with some sort of calamity or misfortune, then do not curse the shaitan because this is exactly what he wants. So therefore it is important to understand the differing circumstances between these two differing ahadith. Otherwise, generally speaking, we know that Allah Jalla wa Ala curses the shaitan. Allah himself says in Surah An-Nisa, لَعَنَهُ اللَّهُ, that Allah cursed him. So from this ayah, there will be scholars who say that it is permissible to send the la'an on shaitan, just in a general sense. However, it is more important to seek refuge in Allah from the shaitan. However, if the shaitan makes you slip up or makes you make a mistake or causes some anger in you, then you do not curse or abuse the shaitan because this is exactly what he wants from you. Rather, when you suffer some sort of loss or a slip up, you humiliate the shaitan by making mention of Allah Jalla wa Ala. As for the da'wah of Sulaiman, then this is well documented in the Quran. Sulaiman alayhi salam said, when he asked Allah Jalla wa Ala, هَبْ لِي مُلْكًا لَا يَنْبَغِي لِأَحَدٍ مِّن بَعْدِي إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْوَهَّابُ. Grant me a dominion which will not be fit for anyone after me, you are the giver. So if the Prophet ﷺ would have power over shaitan, then this means that he would have the dominion which Sulaiman ﷺ had when Sulaiman had power over the shayateen. And because the Prophet ﷺ wanted to respect this dua and this desire of Sulaiman ﷺ, he opted not to take control of shaitan. We can also learn here that sometimes when you try to seek refuge from shaitan, it won't work. Because here the Prophet sought refuge from shaitan 3 times and it didn't work. Shaitan did not go away. So you, O listener, akramakallah, if you are afflicted with wasawis of shaitan or just general torment of shaitan and you are seeking refuge from shaitan and nothing seems to be immediately working, then you need to know that even for the Prophet, it did not immediately work. So you cannot expect it to immediately work for you. But rather, patience and perseverance is what it's all about. And do not expect any miracle results. We can also take that it is possible for a human being to have a visual on shaitan. But Allah Jalla wa Ala says, إِنَّهُ يَرَاكُمْ هُوَ وَقَبِيلُهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا تَرَوْنَهُمْ. He and his group can see you from where you cannot see them. That is true, but it is not in the absolute sense. In certain cases, it is possible for us to see the shaitan, just like it is possible to see the malaika. There is also an interesting observation that has been made here, that the shayateen, even though they are made of fire, they are currently, in their current state, not fiery figures, meaning they're not made out of fire in their current state, even though their origins were fire. Just like the origin of humans were clay, but you do not see human beings made out of clay in their current form. And they make this observation because he says that Iblis came with a flame of fire to put it in my face. If Iblis was physically made out of fire in his current form, he would not need a flame of fire. Merely touching the Prophet would burn him. And Allah knows best. We can also take that it is permissible to tie a prisoner in the masjid. That's what this narration talks about when he says that he would have tied Iblis to the masjid and the children of Medina would have been playing with him. He also did that to Thumama ibn Uthal, who was from a place called Al-Yamama. Hadith 266 from Abu Qatada. He says, I saw the Prophet leading the people in prayer, and Umama bintu Abil As, who is Zainab's daughter. So Umama is the Prophet's granddaughter from Zainab. He was holding her on his shoulders. And when he went into ruku', he put her down. And when he came back from the sajda, he picked her up again. So from this narration we learn that it is permissible to hold a child whilst you are praying, and it makes no difference whether it is a nafila or a fard prayer. Because what you can do in a nafila, you can do in a fard, and this is the general rule. It also shows the loving character of the Prophet ﷺ, in that he is keeping his granddaughter close to him, as no doubt Umama would feel attached to the Prophet. One might ask, where was Zainab then to hold the child? It could be possible that Zainab had passed away, because she did pass away during the time of the Prophet. One might ask, is it not true that the child has the urine and feces inside it, and that's najasa? So how could you be holding najasa during the prayer? Well, we say yes, you're not allowed to be holding a container which has najasa during your prayer, but the najasa of the human, meaning the human waste, is not najis when it is inside the body. It only becomes najis outside the body. So whereas you're not allowed to hold a bottle containing some najasa, let's say urine, whilst in the prayer, but you are allowed to hold a child, even though the child may have urine in its bladder, but it is not najis because it has not been discharged from the body. This is the difference.
We may take that it is permissible to bring children into the masjid, but the parents or the awliya need to make sure that the children are not causing a disruption. But in principle, it is permissible to bring children into the masjid. There are some narrations which talk about removing the children from the masjid, but they are weak. As for this narration, of course, it is authentic. And we have another narration as well, where the Prophet says, I enter the Salah wanting to prolong it, then I hear the crying of a baby, and I lighten the Salah because of the severe worry the mother would have. As for holding a child in the Salah, then it makes no difference whether it is a nafila or fard. It's just that you need to ensure that if the child urinates, because babies of course can urinate, that it does not get onto you. Nowadays there are nappies for babies, and so that should not be a problem.
Hadith 267 from Sahl ibn Sa'ad. He says, talking about the mimbar of the Prophet made out of wood, he says that I saw the Prophet standing on it and making takbir as he led the people in prayer. And then when he wanted to go into the sajda, he walked backwards and he prostrated on the base of the mimbar. Then when he got back up, he stood on the mimbar again. Then after the salah, he said, Ya ayyuhan nas, inni innama sana'tu hadha lita'tammu bi wa lita'allamu salati. O people, I only did this so that you may follow me, meaning take my lead, and that you may learn my salah. So the mimbar of the Prophet had 3 steps, and he prayed on the mimbar so that people could see him, as he is higher than them. So obviously it will be easier to see him. As for making the sajda, then is it permissible to make the sajda on a place which is raised? Well, we say yes, it is permissible to make the sajda on a place which is raised, as long as it does not appear that you are standing up. So you have to be in a prostrating position. In other words, you must be lower than you are higher. Because if you're too high, it would seem as though you are standing up, and this defeats the purpose of the sajda. So even though your sajda place can be slightly raised, it mustn't be too raised such that you resemble a standing person. This narration is similar to where the Prophet said about the Hajj, خُذُوا عَنِّي مَنَاسِكَكُمْ, take from me your rituals. So you are allowed to pray so that others can learn from you, and this is not showing off, because showing off would be that you pray or do some act of worship so that others can be impressed and praise you. Also, we learn a vital lesson from this, that if there is some concern that people may find your actions strange, then you must clear any doubts. Because here the people may find it strange that the Prophet is praying on the mimbar. So the Prophet explained to the people this is the reason why he did it, just so as to clear up any doubts and to remove any potential fitna.
We may take that making a few steps forward or back for a need does not harm the salah. The imam can pray on a place higher than the ma'mum for a genuine need, not just for no need whatsoever, just like the Prophet did here. He did so because of a genuine need. Otherwise, the asl is that they need to be on the same level. We can take that a mimbar is permissible for the imam or the khatib. The narration also says that the mimbar was made out of 3 steps, so that is the sunnah. We may also take that the ma'mum can look at the imam if he needs to know what position he needs to be in, and that does not harm the salah. Similarly, you can look at the ma'mum in front of you if you are unsure which position you should be in. And again, that does not harm the salah. In fact, it is for the benefit of your salah.
Hadith 268 from Abu Hurairah. He says that the Prophet forbade putting your hands on your hips when you are in the Salah. And the reason for this is because this is the actions of the Yahud. Rather, we know what the Sunnah is. It is to put your right hand over the left hand on your chest area. Some people put their right hand over the left hand towards the left-hand side of the chest because they say that this is where the heart mainly is. And we find really that there is no evidence for this. This is simply istihsan on their part, something which they deem to be good. However, their Sharia, as is well known, is not based on what the people deem to be good. Rather, it is based on the Quran and the authentic Sunnah.
The weightier opinion is that this prohibition denotes hurma, that it is haram to do so, and not merely makruh. Now some scholars like the Zahiriyya will say that doing so will break your salah, but most do not say it will break your salah. But nevertheless it is haram because you do not want to imitate the Yahud.
Hadith number 269 from Mu'ayqib. The Prophet mentioned the ruling on wiping the stones from the ground as you go into the prostration. He said, إِن كُنْتَ لَا بُدَّ فَاعِلًا فَوَاحِدًا. If you have to clear the stones from the ground, then remove one stone only. We learn from this narration firstly that they did not have carpets in those days to make sajda upon. They would be making sajda upon raw earth, which would have stones and rough surface, of course. And because of this, you might feel tempted to clear the stones away, or the pebbles or whatever, in order to make sajda. But the Prophet says you should not do this, and if you have to, then remove one only. And this is because it defeats the tawadu', or the lowliness or humbleness you have to show in the sajda. Likewise, it is hated, or makruh, for you to wipe your forehead as well, if after coming back up, some dust or stones get stuck to the forehead. And if you think about it, if people start doing this, then the later generations would start thinking that this is from the Sunnah, that you always wipe your forehead after coming up from the sajda. Normally, nowadays, this ought not to be a problem because the masajid are carpeted, and normally you are praying on a smooth, clean surface. But if it happens to be the case that you have to pray on a surface which is rough and it has pebbles and dust and so on, then you should not clear out the place for the sajda. And if you have to, then remove just one stone. The ruling on clearing out the stones from the ground is that it is makruh. And also wiping the stones from the ground, this is from the abath, or from the futile, useless activities which don't belong to the original prayer, and they don't enhance your prayer in any way. It's a bit like, let's say, clicking your fingers. This is abath, just these silly, futile activities. However, it is possible and permissible to lay down a cloth on the floor so that you could pray on this. So if that would help, then this is permissible. As for putting down a cloth only for the sajda place, meaning the forehead, then this is the actions of the Shia, as we know, and we ought not to imitate them, unless it be the case that it is, let's say, extremely hot, and prostrating on the ground would obviously harm your head, so that would be a valid reason. Otherwise, we ought not to imitate the Shia.
Also, we have in Sunan at-Tirmidhi, the Prophet saying, إِذَا قَامَ أَحَدُكُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَلَا يَمْسَحْ الْحَصَى فَإِنَّ الرَّحْمَةَ تُوَاجِهُ. When one of you stands up to pray, then do not wipe the pebbles, because rahmah or mercy is facing you. So in other words, do not occupy your thoughts with anything other than the salah, otherwise you may not have the full mercy which you are entitled to. However, we say that if you must, then let it just be one pebble or one stone, so keeping it to a minimum.
Hadith 270 from Anas ibn Malik, the Prophet said, إِذَا كَانَ أَحَدُكُمْ فِي الصَّلَاةِ فَإِنَّهُ يُنَاجِي رَبَّهُ فَلَا يَبْزُقَنَّ بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ وَلَا عَنْ يَمِينِهِ وَلَكِنْ عَنْ شِمَالِهِ تَحْتَ قَدَمِهِ. When one of you is in the prayer, he is in a private consultation with his Lord, so let him not spit in front of him nor to his right, but rather he should spit towards the left-hand side under his foot. Likewise, in the same chapter, the Prophet said, الْبُزَاقُ فِي الْمَسْجِدِ خَطِيئَةٌ وَكَفَّارَتُهَا دَفْنُهَا. Spitting in the masjid is a sin, and its expiation is to bury that spit under the ground. And also in the same chapter, another narration from Abu Dharr, the Prophet ﷺ said, عُرِضَتْ عَلَيَّ أَعْمَالُ أُمَّتِي حَسَنُهَا وَسَيِّئُهَا فَوَجَدْتُ فِي مَحَاسِنِ أَعْمَالِهَا الْأَذَى يُمَاطُ عَنِ الطَّرِيقِ ووجدت من مساوي أعمالها النخاعة تكون في المسجد لا تدفن. He said, the actions of my ummah were displayed before me, the good actions and the evil actions. I found from the good actions that a harmful object is removed from the path, and I found from the evil actions some phlegm in the masjid which is not buried. Now the thing is, spit and phlegm are both tahir. Nevertheless, it is not permissible for that to be in the masjid, because of the harm it brings to the people, and we know that whatever harms the people harms the malaika, and there must be no harm, as the Prophet said, La darar wa la dirar. There should be no intentional nor unintentional harming, and particularly in the masjid, which is a place of congregation, especially there must not be any harm. And it is a sin to spit in the masjid or to have phlegm in the masjid. And as for when you're in the prayer, then you have to observe etiquettes. You do not spit to the front nor to the right. You do not spit to the front because you are addressing Allah Jalla wa Ala. So these are the proper etiquettes, and you do not spit to the right because of the extra honoring the right hand side has. So if you must spit, it should be to the left under your foot. But nevertheless, you're not allowed to spit in the masjid, neither to the front nor right nor left. In the masjid, if you have to spit, then it should be on your clothes, as the Prophet ﷺ told us, and then you rub your clothes together so as to remove the spit or the phlegm altogether, because the image obviously is abhorrent. The Prophet ﷺ tells us in the same chapter, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ قِبَلَ وَجْهِهِ إِذَا صَلَّى, because Allah is in front of him when he prays. So Allah being in front of you, how do we understand this? Well, we say, we understand the words, but we say that Allah is in front of you as well. He is above the 7 heavens. Now this does not mean that he is physically in front of you. He is in front of you in a way which fits him. But we do not say that Allah is here on earth, as some people would say that Allah is everywhere. This is impermissible to believe. But seeing as though the Prophet has forbidden spitting in front of you or to your right in the prayer, do we say that this breaks the prayer because it's a prohibition specific to the prayer? Well, here we say no, it doesn't break the prayer, but rather it is only bad etiquettes in the prayer, but it's not pertaining to the actual prayer itself. So it doesn't break the prayer, but it is haram nevertheless. But this action is not pertaining to the actual prayer itself. If you see some spit or phlegm in the masjid, should you just leave it alone? Well, the answer is no. Just like you remove a harmful object from the street, you remove this phlegm or this spit in the masjid, and you don't just leave it alone. And you shouldn't say, well, I didn't do it, therefore I'm not going to deal with it. Rather, it is a good action and a righteous action to deal with it. Just like removing a harmful object from the street. You didn't put it there, but it would be a sadaqah in your favor if you removed it. And so we say the ruling on removing the spit or the phlegm from the masjid is that it is fard kifaya. Somebody absolutely must do it, otherwise everybody is sinful. Also, we can learn that if you make something haram, give an alternative. So it's haram to spit in front of you or to the right, but the alternative is you can spit to the left and beneath your left foot.
It is worth noting that in some narrations, the Prophet saw this spit in the masjid and he became angry, and it could be seen on his face, and he admonished the people. So yes, the Imam can admonish the people if he is angry that the people are not observing proper etiquettes. We also see from this narration that the right-hand side is being honored, and this you'll find to be a common theme, because here you are permitted to spit on the left-hand side. However, it needs to be noted that if you're in the Jama'ah and you have somebody standing to your left, then this should not be done. In fact, in the Sunan, there is a narration which explicitly states that you can spit to the left if it is empty or free.
Hadith 271, Sa'id ibn Yazid asked Anas ibn Malik, did the Prophet used to pray with his shoes on? And Anas replied, yes. We just take a very simple lesson from this, that the usual practice of the Prophet would be to pray with his shoes on, not off. In fact, praying with your shoes off is from the Sunnah of the Yahud. And this is a Prophet Sunnah we find nowadays. It is neglected. Everybody seems to be praying with their shoes off. Now, in a carpeted masjid, this is understandable. But what about if you're praying outside the masjid? Just in a normal room, or perhaps in a park, or something like this. You would find even then people taking their shoes off. And the question there needs to be, why would you want to go against the Sunnah and imitate the Yahud? Even in the masajid in those days, they would pray with their shoes on, only they would look at their shoes before they enter. If there is any dirt on the shoes, they would remove it, and then they would enter the masjid and pray with their shoes on. Nowadays this is not feasible, but it is certainly feasible to pray with your shoes on outside the masajid.
As for if you take your shoes off, then put them in between your feet during the salah. In a carpeted masjid, this could be done in a carrier bag. In fact, we have in Sunan Abi Dawud the Prophet authentically saying, إِذَا صَلَّ أَحَدُكُمْ فَخَلَعَ نَعْلَيْهِ فَلَا يُؤْذِي بِهِمَا أَحَدًا وَلْيَجْعَلْهُمَا بَيْنَ رِجْلَيْهِ أَوْ لِيُصَلِّ فِيهِمَا. If one of you prays and he takes his shoes off, then do not harm anyone with it. Either you put them between your feet, or you pray in your shoes.
Hadith 272 from Aisha. She says the Prophet was praying with a khamisa which had some lines on it, colorful lines. And the Prophet said after the prayer, شَغَلَتْنِي أَعْلَامُ هَذِهِ فَاذْهَبْ بِهَا إِلَى أَبِي جَهْمٍ وَأْتُونِي بِأَنْبِجَانِيِّهِ. These lines distracted me, so take this khamisa back to Abu Jahm and bring me his ambijani, which is the clothing made of rough cloth which does not have any patterns. So what we find here is that the Prophet is praying with a khamisa which has some colorful lines. This clothing was given to him as a gift from Abu Jahm, and naturally the Prophet accepts these gifts. But this gift posed a problem. The Prophet could not pray in this because of the distraction. So he said that these lines distracted me, so he returned the gift. But you ought not to return the gift because the giver will take offense to this. So this is why the Prophet said, and bring me his ambijani, which is the rough clothing with no patterns. And this is to show Abu Jahm that the Prophet does in fact value his gifts, and he's not just merely rejecting his gift. So from this narration we take a more general ruling. It is that you must ensure that there is nothing distracting you in the prayer, neither in your clothing nor in the prayer mat. Some prayer mats have extravagant patterns and designs, and this really should not be the case. And in another authentic narration, Aisha had some curtains in her home which had some extravagant patterns, and the Prophet told her to take down these patterns because they would distract him in the prayer. So the idea is anything which would distract you in your prayer, be it on your clothing, on the prayer mat, or in your surroundings, should be removed or covered before you pray.
So we say it is makruh to wear anything in the salah which would distract you.
Hadith 273 from Anas bin Malik, the Prophet said, إِذَا حَضَرَ الْعَشَاء وَأُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةِ فَابْدَأُوا بِالْعَشَاءِ. When you are eating your evening meal and the prayer has been established, the iqamah has been given, then you begin with your asha, your evening meal first. Then you go off to the prayer. Likewise in the same chapter, the Prophet said, لا صلاة بحضرة الطعام ولا وهو يدافعه الأخبثان. There is no salah when the food has been served, neither when he is desperately stopping himself from relieving himself from the two impurities, meaning the feces and the urine. The reasons for this hadith should be obvious. It will distract you in your prayer. So if the food is served and you're praying, you would be thinking about the food. But this is on the condition that firstly you are hungry, so it will distract you. Because it could be the case that the food is served but you're not hungry at all. In this case it will not distract you, therefore you begin with the prayer. The second condition is that you are able to eat this food. So if the food is in a place where you're not able to reach it, then you begin with the prayer. Or for example, you are able to reach it but you're fasting. In this case you also begin with the prayer. Or perhaps you are able to reach it and you're able to eat it as well, but it's far too hot and you have to allow it to cool down, and in this case you begin with the prayer. As for you wanting to relieve yourself, yes, if you're praying and you really need to relieve yourself, then of course this is going to serve as a distraction for you in your prayer. So you relieve yourself first, make the wudu, and then enter the prayer, even if you missed 1 or 2 rak'at, and even if you missed the whole jama'ah. And these excuses are genuine excuses for you to leave off the Salat al-Jama'ah. Similarly, if you're feeling in slumber and you're not able to discern what you are saying, you must rest first and then pray. But are these excuses enough for you to delay the prayer from its time so that you pray after its time? Some scholars say no, you must pray within its time, whatever the excuse is. Other scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah say that these are excuses which would justify you praying after the time of the prayer finishes. And this is the better, more practical opinion, that these are excuses which would allow you to join or combine the two prayers. So for example, if you missed the Dhuhr prayer because of the food, or you missed it because you have to sleep because you're so tired, then the time of Dhuhr ends, this would be an excuse which would enable you to join between the Dhuhr and Asr. Because of course after Dhuhr, the Asr time begins straight away. So you would be able to join the prayers there. And we know the Prophet ﷺ joined the prayers in Al-Madinah when he was not traveling and there was no rain, nor there was any fear. And the reason for this, Ibn Abbas explained, he did not want to cause any hardship on his ummah. Because here you are missing the timing of the prayer due to an excuse which the Sharia itself has given you. So therefore you cannot be held responsible. So for example, you must relieve yourself, but in so doing the timing of the prayer would finish. We say no problem, relieve yourself first, because the Sharia has given you permission to do this. Hadith number 284 from Jabir ibn Abdullah, that the Prophet said, "Man akala al-basala wal-thuma wal-qurrath فلا يقربن المسجدنا فإن الملائكة تتأذى مما يتأذى منه بنو آدم." Whoever eats onions or garlics or leek, then let him not even come near this masjid of ours, because the malaika are annoyed by that which annoys the children of Adam. So we find here from this hadith that if you eat these three food items, they naturally give off a stench. So if you now enter the masjid, you will harm or annoy others because of this stench. It is permissible to eat these food items, there's no doubt about that. But then eating them and coming to the masjid afterwards, this is the issue. You can come to the masjid after eating them if you've cooked them such that their smell is suppressed. So if that's the case and you've cooked them properly and you were to eat them and there's no smell coming from you because of these food items, then there is no problem, you can come to the masjid. Is the ruling restricted to these three items? We say definitely not. We can make an analogy and use cigarettes. So somebody smokes and comes to the masjid, definitely this gives off a strong stench. So he should not be allowed to come into the masjid. And other things like body odor. If somebody hasn't washed properly and there is a stench coming from him because of the body odor, then again he's not allowed to come to the masjid. Likewise in the masjid, passing wind which would give off a stench. Again this is haram because it annoys the people and it annoys the malaika as well. So this idea of not coming to the masjid, is this some sort of lightening of the load, a rukhsah? We say no, it is not a rukhsah, such that for example an ill person does not have to come to the masjid. This is a rukhsah. We say rather this is a ta'zir, punishment. The fact that you are denied access to the masjid is a punishment. Not just that, but if somebody has a stench, then the imam is well within his rights to eject that person out from the masjid. And we know, as it is reported in the same chapter, that if the Prophet found the smell of onions or garlic coming from a person in the masjid, he would ask him to leave and go to al-Baqi'. The Prophet called the garlic and onions khabith, or the tree which grows them, khabith, and this does not mean that it is haram, rather it is khabith from the other angle, that it gives off an offensive stench. Otherwise, khabith could mean impure and khabith could be haram, but in this context, khabith is just something which annoys others.
Also in the chapter, Umar radiallahu anh says that whoever eats these food items should kill its odor by cooking it well. So if you've cooked it well and then eat garlic, leek or onions, then that would not be a problem because you will not have an odor being emitted from you.
Hadith 285 from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, "Man sami'a rajulan yanshudu dallatan fil masjid falyaqul la raddaha Allahu alayk fa inna al-masajida lam tubna li hadha." Whoever hears a man announcing his lost animal in the masjid, then you should say to him, "May Allah not return it to you, for the masajid were not built for this purpose." The reason for this hadith should be clear. Masajid are a place where people gather together for the purpose of worship and learning about the deen. If we allow people to announce their lost items in the masjid, then faster than lightning the masajid will become places where people will just start to announce their lost property items and start using masajid for their personal uses. And the same thing can be said with trade. If you see people trading in the masjid, you must make dua against them. La arbaha Allahu tijaratak. May Allah not give you any profit in your trade. Because again, people will just start taking masajid as places of trade for their own personal benefit. And this is a clear violation and abuse of the masjid. Masajid are built for the remembrance of Allah Jalla wa Ala, whether it be in prayer, in recitation of the Quran, or in circles of knowledge. It is permissible, however, to put up a notice outside the masjid of any lost property items. That's fine. But inside the masjid is a different story altogether. Just like trading outside the masjid hall is fine, but inside the masjid is a different story. Here in this hadith, you're making dua against a person, and this may be seen as strange. How can you make dua against another Muslim? Well, you can if it is with due right, and here the Sharia does give you due right. So you can make dua against another Muslim in circumstances like these. As for actions which do not belittle the masjid, and there is a benefit for Muslims at large, then these are permissible. For example, in the masjid somebody is fixing weapons to be used for jihad in the way of Allah. Now if this is done in the masjid, then there's no problem with this, because this is a noble act and it serves the Muslim ummah at large. So this type of action would be fine, even though it is not an exact act of worship.
Okay, what about these calendars that companies give out? These calendars are essentially an advertisement for that particular company, so that people can come to know of the company's name, because that is likely to bring you customers. So are calendars like these allowed to be put up in the masjid? The answer is no, because you'll be advertising your business in the masjid through the excuse of a calendar.
Hadith 286. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, إذا نودي بالأذان أدبر الشيطان له ضراط حتى لا يسمع الأذان فإذا قضي الأذان أقبل فإذا ثوب بها أدبر فإذا قضي التثويب أقبل يخطر بين المرء ونفسه يقول أذكر كذا لما لم يكن يذكر حتى يظل الرجل إن يدري كم صلى فإذا لم يدري أحدكم كم صلى فليسجد سجدتين وهو جالس. The Prophet said, when the adhan is given, the shaitan runs away and he passes loud wind so that he cannot hear the adhan. Then when the adhan finishes, he comes back. Then when the iqamah is given, likewise he turns away. And when the iqamah finishes, he comes back. And then he starts to whisper into the person. He tells him to remember such and such, that which he was not remembering previously, until this person forgets how many raka'at he prayed. Then the Prophet said, if one of you does not know how many raka'at he has prayed, then let him make 2 sajdas when he is sitting down. This hadith is pertaining to the sajda as-sahu, the sajda of heedlessness or forgetfulness. Being heedless or absent-minded away from the salah, this is haram. This is where you would not pray during the time of the prayer. As Allah Jalla wa Ala says, فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ. So may destruction be upon those who pray, those who are sahun or absent-minded away from the prayer. So they do not pray in its proper time. As for as-sahu in the prayer, then this is not punishment worthy, because this is where you have forgotten to perform certain actions which you should be performing, or perhaps you did not perform certain actions which you ought to have been performing. So with this type of mistake then, it can be rectified with the sajda as-sahu. We take from the hadith that shaitan cannot stand the dhikr of Allah, in that he runs away from the masjid when the adhan is called out and when the iqamah is called out. We also learn the shaitan is extremely eager to distract you in your prayer. So this could be via waswasa, so he mentions into you to remember such and such, something which does not pertain to the recitation. Or maybe he will whisper into you that perhaps you have broken your wudu, so you need to break your prayer and redo the wudu. Or perhaps he might incite somebody to pass by in front of you. The point is, he's eager to distract you in your prayer and to break your prayer. Because if he cannot stop you from praying, and that would be his ideal task, then the next best thing would be to distract you in your prayer. And a person's reward in his prayer depends on how much he is concentrating and how much khushu' he has, and how much he performs it in accordance with the sunnah, because the Prophet ﷺ said that one of you can pray and he only has 1/10 of a reward, 1/9 and 1/8, 1/7, 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd or 1/2 of a reward. We learn from the hadith that the sajda as-sahu is done when you are sitting down, not when you are standing up. And we also learn that the sajda as-sahu are 2 sajdas, not just 1. So for example, the sajda at-tilawa would be 1 sajda, not 2. But the sajda as-sahu are 2 sajdatan. Hadith 287 from Abdullah ibn Buhayna. He says the Prophet prayed 2 rak'at with us. Then after the 2 rak'at, instead of sitting down for the first tashahhud, he stood up, and the people stood up with him. Then when it was at the end of the prayer, they were expecting him to say the taslim, but rather he made takbir and he prostrated twice whilst he was sitting down, and then he made the taslim afterwards. We find in this narration that the Prophet made a mistake. Instead of sitting down for the first tashahhud, he stood up. Now what this means is that he has left out a wajib action of the prayer, which is the first tashahhud, and to sit down for that first tashahhud as well. These are 2 wajibat which he missed out, and so this is a naqs, or a deficiency in the prayer. So because of this naqs, or this deficiency in the prayer, he made up for it using the sajda as-sahu. 2 of them to be performed while sitting down before the salam, if there is a deficiency in the prayer, meaning you did not perform a particular wajib action in the prayer. We take from this narration that if an imam misses out a wajib action in the prayer, for example the first tashahhud, then you follow the imam in this, because here the companions followed him and the Prophet did not tell them afterwards, you should not have followed me, you should have corrected me. So if an imam leaves off a wajib action, you follow the imam, and then at the end you make the sajda as-saw, or the imam does, and you follow behind him. The ulama say that if you have stood up straight, having missed the first tashahhud, then you don't go back into the standing position because you've already begun the rukn. And so these scholars will say if you have begun reciting the Fatiha, you don't go down because you don't want to intentionally disrupt the rukn of the prayer, which is reciting al-Fatiha. We could argue that if you have stood up straight, you don't go back down because the standing up is a rukn of the prayer. So if you have stood up straight, you don't go back down, rather you just simply make up for it using the sajda as-sahu. As for if you have not stood up straight yet, then you can go back down into the tashahhud position. The ulama say that if you have made a movement to stand up after the 2 rakat instead of sitting down, then because of this extra movement, it would warrant a sajda as-sahu, because in effect you've added to the prayer. Other scholars say no, only if you stand up straight would you need to go in for a sajda as-sahu. Whereas before standing up straight, if you just go back down to the tashahhud position, you carry on praying as you are, and there is no need for sajda as-sahu. So you can see the 2 differing opinions there. It appears the safer one would be that if you have made a movement to go up for the standing position after the 2 rakat, then definitely you have added something to the prayer, and it would be safer to make the sajda as-sahu.
Though it should be noted that the hadith does not give instruction to make the sajda as-sahu if you have not stood up straight. It simply tells us to go back down into the sitting position, and the narration we are referring to is in the Sunan.
However, we need to notice a big difference here. If you are praying Salat al-Dhuhr, let's say, and the imam stands up for a 5th rak'ah, do you follow the imam in this? The answer is no. Here you remain seated, because the 5th rak'ah is not part of the original salah of Dhuhr. And that's quite different to standing up for the 3rd rak'ah in the Dhuhr prayer, because that 3rd rak'ah is part of the original salah. If an imam misses out a rukn of the prayer, then you're not allowed to follow him in this. Rather, you have to notify him to return to your position and perform the rukn of the prayer. So, for example, the imam makes a sajda and then he sits up. Then instead of going for the 2nd sajda, he stands up. Now here you do not follow the imam in this mistake, because the 2nd sajda is a rukn, it's not wajib, which means it is much more serious. And so you have to say subhanallah and notify the imam that he must come back down for the 2nd sajda. You are not allowed to follow him in that particular mistake, because now we're dealing with a rukn which has been left out, not a wajib action. So notice the difference between a rukn and a wajib. Hadith 288 from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, the Prophet said, إذا شك أحدكم في صلاته فلم يدري كم صلى 3 أم 4 فليطرح الشك وليبني على ما استيقن ثم يسجد سجدتين قبل أن يسلم فإن كان صلى 5 شفعنا له صلاته وإن كان صلى إتماما ل4 كانتا ترغيما للشيطان. The Prophet said, if one of you doubts in your prayer, he does not know how many he has prayed, 3 or 4, then let him do away with the doubt and continue his prayer based on what he's sure of. So in other words, out of 3 and 4, you're sure that you prayed at least 3, the doubt is on the 4th. So you pray as if you prayed 3. Then at the end he makes 2 sajdas before he makes the salam. So if he in total had prayed 5, then the sajda as-sahw would make his prayer even. And if it works out that he actually did pray 4 in total, meaning by the end, then the sajda as-sahw would serve as a humiliation for the shaitan. This hadith talks about doubt. Now doubt in the salah is of 2 types. One is a 50-50 doubt, which is what this hadith is talking about, and the other one is a 60-40 doubt, or where you deem one more likely than the other, but you're not certain either way. So in a 50-50 doubt, you are 50-50, did you pray 3 or 4? So you go by what you are certain, which is 3, and you build upon this, and you make the 2 sajda as-sahw before the salam. If you are in a 60-40 doubt, let's say you're 60% sure that you prayed 4, 30% that you prayed 3, in a case like this, you go with the 60%. So you build upon your prayer as if you prayed 4 rak'at, and then you make the sajda as-sahw after the salam, not before. Notice this crucial difference now. Most scholars say that it doesn't make a difference whether you make the sajda as-sahw before the salam or after the salam. And Ibn Taymiyyah says it does make a difference because the Prophet differentiated, so we must differentiate also. So when you make the sajda as-sahw after the salam, you give the salam, and then you make the sajda as-sahw, and then you free yourself from the prayer completely by making the salam again. If you have any doubts after the prayer, meaning after you have said the salam, rule is you don't pay any attention to this doubt whatsoever, because the asl is that you prayed correctly, unless you are sure you prayed incorrectly. So after the prayer, you don't pay any attention to any doubt, 50-50, 60-40, whatever. But the doubt we are talking about, the 2 types of doubts, are during the prayer. And this would dictate whether you make the sajda as-sahw before the salam or after the salam, depending on what type of doubt it is. We find from this narration that the sajda as-sahw is a humiliation for the shaitan. And this makes sense because every time a Muslim makes sajda, the shaitan cries. He says that Ibn Adam has been ordered to make sajda, and he made sajda, and he will have Jannah. And I was ordered to make sajda, and I refused to do so, so I will have the fire. Of course, this refers to when Iblis was ordered to make sajda to Adam alayhi salam, and he refused. As for if you add anything in the prayer, which you should not have added, be it from the standing, or the sitting, or the prostration, or the ruku', then you make the sajda as-sahw after the prayer. And this rationally makes more sense because, let us suppose you add to the prayer, then if you make the sajda as-sahw before the salam, then you've added another sajdatain to the prayer. So you've added 2 things now. First of all, that mistake which you made, and secondly, the sajda as-sahw. So therefore it makes more sense to make the sajda as-sahw after the prayer to prevent you from adding yet more into the prayer which does not originally belong to it. Whereas if you are guilty of a deficiency in the prayer, so you don't do something which you should have done, then it makes more sense to make the sajda as-sahw before the salam, because now you're adding into the prayer to make up for the deficiency previously, from before. So if you think of it like this, then it does make sense that you make the sajda as-sahw after the prayer if you added anything in, and before the prayer if you did not do what you were supposed to do, or you missed out a wajib action. As for if you miss out a rukn, then there's no doubt about this, you have to go back and perform that rukn. Because anything which comes after the salah, if you missed out the rukn, it is all batil. So you need to go back to the place where you missed out the rukn and start from there. Then after you've finished the salah, you make the sajda as-sahw after the prayer, because remember, you've added into the prayer what was not originally from it. So for example, if you stand up after making 1 sajda, so you miss out the 2nd sajda, you do not keep carrying on. Rather, you come back down and perform the 2nd sajda, then you get back up for the next rak'ah. Then when you finish the prayer, you make the sajda as-sahw after the salam. Why? Because remember now, you added in something extra in the prayer. You stood up when you should not have stood up. So if you missed out a rukn, you have to go back and perform that rukn, and there's no other alternative. Then you make the sajda as-sahw afterwards, due to you adding something into the prayer, as in our example previously. And if you missed out a wajib, then if you've begun the next rukn of the salah, you keep carrying on because you don't break the rukn of the salah. If you have not begun the next rukn of the salah, you can go back and perform that wajib action.
So you'll notice the difference between missing out a wajib act and missing out a rukn. Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. What is the ruling on putting your hands on your waist during the salah? and give a possible justification for the ruling. Question number 2. What is the ruling on removing spit or phlegm in the masjid? Question number 3. What is the ruling on announcing a lost property item inside the masjid? And how should one respond to the one who's making such an announcement?